My first concern would be classification. I wouldn't want investigators thinking, well, is this a missing elderly woman? Is this a possible abduction? Is this homicide? The reason why is because you have all these things, Jim. You have the camera activity. You have the camera then disconnected. You got blood evidence. You got missing person who's missing. She's missing from her residence. The circumstances are unusual. And you have communications that have floated in and out of this case. So I guess, Jim, here's the point. At what point would we stop treating something like this as a missing person investigation and start treating it as a potential homicide?
Every dead person found at a scene is, by investigators' perspective, is considered a homicide until proven otherwise.
Welcome to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Jim, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well, Ray, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this tragic case unfolding out of Massachusetts, Duxbury, of this woman who is being charged with, on trial for killing 3 of her children, all, I believe, under 6 years of age or so. Her name is Lindsay Clancy. I know you're familiar with it. I'm sure you've been following the media. It's really tough to wrap as seasoned as we are as investigators, the nasty stuff we've seen over the years. I can't imagine walking to a crime scene like this. She's out on the ground. The mom was slit wrist, a broken back, essentially, and even worse, 3 young children in the basement, all dead, strangled. I can't imagine being the father walking in the door, calling 911. They say the 911 call is so emotionally charged that at least they weren't releasing it for a while. And I'm not sure if the jury heard it yet or not. I imagine the defense may, petition to keep that out. But just a tough story, Ray. And we'll break it down a little bit here. She's still on trial, and they're not even denying she killed the children. The question is, what's the culpability of Big Pharma, the psychologist, the therapist involved? What's your early take on it?
Jim, I think there's really 2 separate questions here. I think one is, was Lindsay Clancy suffering from a significant mental illness? And the second, which I think is even more difficult to answer, is whether the mental illness made her legally incapable of understanding what she was doing to be held criminally responsible for. Jim, you and I have looked at hundreds of offenders and their behavior. When I think of this, and I was thinking about this today before we came on the show, where do we draw the line between explaining someone's behavior and then excusing that same behavior of that individual?
Well, the case that many of us cut our teeth on had nothing to do with children in terms of, insanity, but still guilty, was the attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan by John Hinckley. Remember, he was stalking Jodie Foster, the actress, very young actress back then, and he thought he would impress her by trying to kill President Reagan in Washington, D.C. And we don't have to get into all that case here. People can look it up, but their defense was, basically, he did it, but he's insane. And I think court precedents or legal precedents was established in that case that you could find someone guilty but insane, and it just had different sentencing parameters. It wasn't a death penalty case, or, because it was only attempted homicide and he didn't succeed, it wouldn't be death penalty, but still life in prison. And John Hinckley got out of prison about 4 or 5 years ago because of this insanity defense. So he still served time in prison. So where does the line get drawn here? And this has been going back, was it, Ray, the McNaughton rule in the 1800s? Who's crazy, who's not, using, of course, sort of street terms here, but and how people could be judged within the criminal justice system if, in fact, they did display any sort of element of psychological disorder. And as you know, Ray, people can fake it too. They can pretend they're having these issues. I'm not saying that's the case at all with Lindsay Clancy. It seems like her diagnosed mental health issues were real. We have to ask, how was the treatment given to her? And are those people liable for this? There's a large lawsuit. The husband, I guess he's ex-husband now, he divorced her. He's suing the pharmaceutical companies, different psychological clinics, psychiatrists. And Ray, we both testified in court as experts. I've been grilled on the stand, but nothing like I heard about one of the psychiatrists who I think was only out of her residency for like a month. and she was, given the Lindsay Clancy case, diagnosed her, gave her some drugs, and they apparently ripped her apart on the stand. I wouldn't be surprised if this woman just says, "I'm done. I don't need this kind of stuff anymore." Basically her first case in her first month. I'm not apologizing for her. I'm not saying I feel sorry. This is such a messy case, and the jury will be tasked with some difficult questions here, and they're going to have to sort everything out. Again, no one's denying the woman killed her kids and tried to kill herself. It's saying, is she culpable, or is did her mental health diagnosis somehow obviate her from and getting the full sentence in this matter?
Jim, I agree. And I look at this from an investigator's point of view, thinking about mental illness. That doesn't automatically equate to legal insanity. As an investigator, I'm looking at different things. I'm looking at what did she say? What did she do? What did she know? What did she understand? What did she do before she killed her children? What did she do immediately afterward? And, you're going to look at all these things. But one of the problems that I see with this is that some of the public discussion in this, Jim, is that people are treating a psychiatric diagnosis almost like a defense. And I don't think that's the way it should be. The diagnosis is evidence. That's it. It's no more than that. The legal question is not what that illness did to her ability to understand reality and control her behavior. So with that, can somebody I'll ask you this, and I already know what I'll say, and I think I know what you'll say to this too, Jim. Can somebody be profoundly mentally ill and still know that killing their children is wrong?
I would say yes. But there is certainly an argument experts could make in the other direction. And that's what's happening right now as we speak in a courtroom, in the New England area of this country. And there are experts on both sides debating this particular issue. Again, this is not a brand new issue, and mothers have killed children before. And actually, this is all, she was a pediatric nurse, and apparently she was promoted and she had honors and awards and things, taking care of other women's children. Can you imagine if your daughter or granddaughter was under the supervision of this nurse? Fortunately, those children seemingly weren't harmed, but she could have easily also come like an angel of death and doing bad things to the children, or Munchausen by proxy, something like that. Fortunately, that does not seem to be the case. Unfortunately, she took it all out on her own kids. You also have to ask, I'm not blaming the husband here, but boy, did he miss some things on his wife. Should he have gone out and run these errands for 45 minutes? And again, I'm not putting him criminally or even civilly liable here, but there were enough signs of this woman with suicidal ideation calling different hotlines, 800 numbers, clinics, and some of them just said, well, if you're only talking about suicide, but you're not really going to plan on doing it, then we can't help you. Call back when you're ready to actually kill yourself. I read that as part of the investigation here, or perhaps even testimony, someone dropped the ball there. And we're not going to belabor this issue. We have some other things we want to discuss, but I'm still old school. I believe people are ultimately responsible for what they do. It could be an accident, a car accident, and you hurt 4 children or 3 children, killed them, and but you are still ultimately responsible for that. This woman is ultimately responsible. The end for me, that would be satisfactory. I don't really care how it's determined, guilty but insane but guilty, as long as she spends the rest of her life in prison. And those other women in prison who didn't have a chance to have kids, they're going to give her kind of a tough time. She's not going to get along in prison very well. Now, of course, she's in a wheelchair. She's going to be in a special hospital clinic, no doubt. And I'm not sure how much people can do to her when she's already paralyzed in a wheelchair. It's just a totally sad story, certainly for those 3 children.
Jim, my daughter reached out to me. She lives in Florida, and she says, did you hear about this case? And I've heard a little bit, but she says it's all over the internet, social media. There's a lot of speculation online. I don't know if you heard this, but they're saying that there's evidence that Patrick Clancy, the husband, is actually the killer. So I want to just talk about this a little bit because it's a hot topic in the social media and on the internet. You have legitimate investigative hypotheses, and then you have internet theories. Now, from an investigative standpoint, I'm looking at different things. I'm looking at the timeline. Did he have the opportunity to do it? One thing. Physical evidence that would connect him to it. which would, and then blood, DNA, things of that nature. Was the evidence at the scene staged? All these questions, inconsistencies in his statements, evidence that he had a motive that was independent of his children or his marital status. In other words, something other than related to his wife. You go through some of these things, and I haven't seen credible public reporting that establish any of these things. In fact, as you mentioned earlier, the 911 call and his testimony have been presented before the jury, and the prosecution's case and the defense are still saying that Lindsay is the person who killed her children. They're not denying that. But I think what I think is really, if you or I were the investigator that arrived at this house, I can't believe it would probably, if I arrived at this house and saw those three kids, that's something that never leaves you. But the question is, and I think I know your answer to this too, Jim, would we treat the husband as a suspect, a witness, or both? What do you think, Jim?
Well, as our audience knows well, the inner circle is very important, and every single member of that inner circle of a family, of a friend group, whatever it is, all have to be investigated, talked to, interviewed. So, of course, he has to be asked. But yeah, I think this is one of those rumors that we tend to avoid on Cold Red, but I have no problem you bringing it up. But it seems the police, the defense, you think the wife would have even come out and said, "Oh, my husband actually did it, not me." You think somewhere that would have come out. Why would she be protecting him at this point? I think he's only gone 45 minutes, if I recall. And I'm sure everywhere has cameras now. Most streets have, intersections have cameras now. So I'm sure they put him in pocket wherever his cell phone pinged back and forth. So if there was even any doubt that he spent, even 10 minutes longer inside that house where he would have had the opportunity or at least the time to harm his children, I think that somehow would have come out. So I'm assuming the police have this part right. It's the grander question of, where is that line drawn between psychological issues and criminal malfeasance and criminal responsibility. And that's what the jury is going to have to decide here. And the ultimate case is, as long as she stays in jail, it's not a death penalty state. So even killing three kids, she will not get the lethal injection. So as far as I'm concerned, my opinion, innocent till proven guilty, but she's already admitted she did it. So once convicted, I would hope she's just in prison for the rest of her life. It's not going to be a very good life in a wheelchair, and her years are numbered for that reason alone, because what she did to herself. So, and of course, the verdict will also determine where some of these lawsuits go. And you can say the husband is trying to make money or something like that now, but hey, he's lost three kids, and if she was that grossly misdiagnosed, meaning his wife, it's arguable that he could deserve compensation. And I think these will be settled out of court. She gets guilty, no matter how she goes to jail for prison. Again, hopefully for life, from my perspective. These big pharma and these pharmaceutical, psychological clinics, whatever, they'll settle out of court. They don't want this going to court.
I'm going to throw this out, Jim, and based upon what has been all over the internet and the internet theory and all this, I think it really brings about a very interesting psychological component. And I wonder and I question if people are asking that Patrick, and there's evidence pointing toward him, is it because they're having difficulty that their mother could not have killed her own children? I mean, the people on the internet are the only people that are disputing that Lindsay killed her children. The prosecution and defense, both. They say she was suffering from postpartum psychosis, and therefore she wasn't criminally responsible. That they're giving them a reason. So, I mean, Jim, if you've investigated and you've investigated homicide case, you've been part of these things for years. If someone came to you with this theory that Patrick killed his own children, what would be some of the pieces of evidence that you'd want to examine before you even gave that statement any type of credit?
Well, certainly the crime scene, certainly the implements utilized to kill the children, the availability, the circumstances, the timeline, of course, very important. DNA or fingerprints in Patrick's own home wouldn't really have any value unless it was some biological fluids. We won't even go there. But just, saliva or something, just on the basement floor, whatever, near his tool room, that in of itself wouldn't have all that much probative value. So, and of course, an interview of the person. Now, you could lawyer up right away, which would tell you something. I'd also like to hear the 911 call, which I haven't, and his manner at that particular time. I mean, his life changed forever in those moments, and we'd have to judge him. If you want to think he possibly was a co-conspirator to this, okay, his life changed forever. If he came home after running these errands, his life changed forever. It's just a question of what was the catalyst for that change. So, of course, you'd want to interview him, and you'd really have to get into the weeds with him and lock in his alibi, so to speak. But it seems like the police did that. And Ray, you opened this last question with, people don't want to believe mothers can kill their children. Unfortunately, they do, and in different ways, by different means. Sometimes it's just a fit of anger. Sometimes there's some level of pre-planning to it. Sometimes there's leakage weeks or months or years in advance, and you don't think our whole biological setup, mothers nurturing, giving birth, carrying the children within them. You'd think somehow there's no way the brain would allow something like this to happen, but through history it has. And there are, recent examples in Texas, a woman who drowned 5 kids, I believe, 5 of her children. And I remember that case going to trial. I think there was actually she was convicted, then it was overturned, but then she was reconvicted. The woman who killed in North Carolina, is it Susan Smith, killed her 2 children because her new boyfriend didn't want to have, little kids running around the house. So she put him in a car, put him in a lake somewhere, said some black guy kidnapped them. It was all bogus, all a lie. And within 3 days, she admitted to it. So, yeah, this happens in history. Obviously, it's more notable now with social media, whatever, but mothers are very aware, are very capable if the right situations present themselves. No mother I ever knew or I'm related to or maybe even crossed paths with, but there's been a few of them I've interviewed. I've had mothers that sexually abuse their little children, helping their husbands sexually abuse the children. And would the next step be, killing them? I don't know. But luckily, in the one case I just referenced, we locked the mother and father up and they didn't have a chance to kill their kids. So I'll throw it back at you, Ray. I mean, would you handle it any differently?
No, Jim, I agree 1,000% with you. I don't think there's, with these people on the internet and them coming up with all their thoughts about this, there's nothing wrong with wondering or asking whether a suspect was investigated, whether it's the father or somebody else. The problem I see here, and I won't say anything else about this, is when a question becomes a conclusion without evidence. I think that's the problem.
Yeah, and we try to avoid that on Cold Red, and I have no problem addressing this with our audience, but I think most of our audience doesn't get too hung up on these internet-type rumors and expect us to spend, an extended period of time discussing them, which we kind of just did. But no, we talk enough about the inner circle of a family. And so, okay, of course a husband is on the inner circle. And when one spouse is injured or hurt, you have to always look at the other spouse, depending, how it happened, certainly children. But in this case, it seems the police investigated this properly from the very beginning, and they figured out what happened. And it seems no one is denying the physical acts that occurred within that house that day or that night, whatever time it was. And the question is, should something differently have been done for Lindsay Clancy in terms of her treatment leading up to that time? That is where the argument lies now. There's going to be expert witnesses going back and forth, and we'll see ultimately what the jury says about that.
Perfect, Jim. It really is. And we're gonna move on and talk about a case that you and I have talked about a long time. We're going to revisit the unsolved disappearance of Nancy Guthrie and how to evaluate early investigative missteps that can stall cases. One of the things that bothers me in this case, Jim, is that we know there were mistakes made, but we don't really know what those mistakes are because we don't have the complete investigative file. So there's a lot of things that I think, however, there's enough questions in this case that we should look to start looking into with this in reference to this, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, people throw the word autopsy around a lot. It's by definition for, the forensic examination of a dead body, but there are political autopsies, from the last presidential run. They use that term for the Democrats, and also you can say the autopsy of an investigation, so to speak. But Look, Ray, you and I have never worked a case together in which some mistakes weren't made. They aren't necessarily big ones, but looking back, oh, maybe if we just, interviewed this guy this day instead of the other day. But, we didn't really have probable cause. We didn't have the grounds. We didn't actually, have an address yet. Something like that. Something went off to a lab a day sooner or something like that. But yeah, I think it's tough for us on the outside to criticize either the sheriff's department or the FBI because we're not there. And should they have worked together sooner? Should the Pima County sheriffs brought in the FBI sooner? There's some aviation attributes or benefits that the sheriff's department had that apparently the sheriff shut down a month before. Maybe they could have done some aerial research or investigation the day of, when Nancy first went missing. So there are a lot of things that we can look back in that regard. Did they give up the house too soon? And was there some evidence missed when other people went inside of it, et cetera? So, I mean, every investigation is going to have some problems like that. What you just have to hope for, they're not insurmountable. And so far, we don't know of any bits of evidence that were perhaps lost that were insurmountable, meaning we can never get them back and they're lost forever. But the inside investigators may know that. So I'm hesitant to criticize any one person, not to mention an agency, when I don't have all the facts to go on. Do we all wish this was solved like a CSI episode or Criminal Minds? Of course, but it doesn't happen that way in real life. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping took 2 years. There's other cases that took, much longer. The last real kidnapping, I think, was Sidney Riso, the Exxon executive in North Jersey in 1992. That took 3 weeks. Obviously, we're well past 3 weeks with Nancy Guthrie. That was an actual kidnapping. Who knows what the heck we have here? And we discussed that an episode or two ago, Ray, with Natalie Schilling. So, yeah, so mistakes made, I'm sure there are, and I'm sure bosses as well as individual investigators, maybe question some things they did or didn't do. And I want to come up to one specific example that just was in the news in the last day or so. But I'll turn it back to you in terms of how you look at things such as this. We both worked on task forces, FBI, other agencies. How do you see what you know so far?
Jim, I keep coming back to this question, and I think, our audience has heard this where it's almost been browbeaten. And I really think what they would like to know is, Jim and Ray, what would you have done if the case was handed to you on February 1st? If I came into this case, maybe a day late with the Bureau like you, my first concern would be classification. I wouldn't want investigators thinking, well, is this a missing elderly woman? Is this a possible abduction? Is this homicide? The reason why is because you have all these things, Jim. You have the camera activity. You have the camera then disconnected. You got blood evidence. You got missing person who's missing. She's missing from her residence. The circumstances are unusual. And you have communications that have floated in and out of this case. So I guess, Jim, here's the point. At what point would we stop treating something like this as a missing person investigation and start treating it as a potential homicide?
Every dead person found at a scene is, by investigators' perspective, is considered a homicide until proven otherwise. In my working of these types of cases, and these are very, very rare, but even from a historical perspective, I would have walked in the door, assuming she's not a walk away after an hour or two. Nothing like that made sense, as some older people do sometimes, or real little kids. They just handle it as a forced abduction. So I'm not saying the word kidnapping. We don't know if that's the case or not, but a forced abduction for whatever reason. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the investigators doing that from day one. Now, they can combine different modalities of investigative energies, if you will. They can put out search dogs and cadaver dogs and helicopters and aircraft and drones and search all the surrounding area, do neighborhood canvases, of course, knocking on doors. I'd like to think they did all those things. I'm not sure exactly how much that first Sunday, but certainly by Monday and Tuesday, I think they turned the crime scene over, or they released it, I should say, by Tuesday. That was probably done too soon. Then they recaptured it again a few days later. And, I don't want to be a one-trick pony here, but I do think this abduction had to do with with Savannah Guthrie and the fact that she was a celebrity. And I'm hoping in the very, very early days, certainly within that first week, they started mining her emails at NBC, going back at least 5 years. And every single person that's not a friend or a producer or some, other celebrity reaching out for her, everybody who's sort of a stranger who sent her these emails or to her production staff, folks like that, PR people, that's what should have been investigated early on. And I hope it started then, and I hope it's still going. If they've covered everything for 5 years, go back another 5 years and find out who's been emailing her then. So these are the types of things that, maybe you couldn't have put a full court press on the very first day or two. First, you're looking for, her wandering around. You're looking for any evidence, her body, maybe clothing, anything like that. But after that, they should be focused on the inner circle, which they did do, but then also the inner circle of Savannah. She's the celebrity here, and I'm hoping they just focused on that too, meaning all the communications she's had over the last 5 to 10 years. I have a feeling someday, if this case is ever resolved, the person who took Mrs. Guthrie is going to be in that email list somewhere under some ruse or something to get Savannah's attention. He didn't get it, and he decided to do this.
Jim, I'm going to tell you, if I would have came on this job, the house to me is the first crime scene until I have evidence telling me otherwise. Now, you and I know that there's never just one crime scene. Very rarely is there just one crime scene. Sometimes there is, but very rarely. In this situation, I think we have an abduction site. We have a site where she was killed or she died. And the last is the disposal site or burial site. So I'm going to make sure, as you said earlier, we're going to preserve that residence. We're going to recover every single piece of digital evidence that we can. We're going to look for the camera systems, router information, Wi-Fi, entries and accidents. We're going to canvas. We're going to do a timeline, do all those things. But here's one of my biggest philosophies. A lot of times people let technology tell them what evidence exists. And I'm a firm believer that get the expert in there, the forensic examiner, and let him tell you what exists. Look at that camera issue. I mean, I'm not even sure all the information that was out there actually came through. Jim, if someone tells you, hey, Jim, just want you to know the doorbell camera didn't record anything, would you accept that?
I'd want a second opinion, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why we have forensic people. Get them in there. Here's the thing that was really big in this, Jim, was the ransom communications. They're fascinating because every communication is from an unknown offender and is potentially evidence. There's a question just popped up on the screen, Jim. What's the typical distance for the secondary crime scene? How many miles? I'm going to be honest with you. It varies. It can be 1 mile. It depends on the offender. A lot depends upon the offender. And usually they'll have disposal sites that'll be set up. It all depends upon the offender and what they're planning an operation, how organized they are in reference to doing this. So that's a great question, but it varies.
The means of transportation's a factor too. Do they
Correct.
have, are they carrying someone out a door? Do they have, the right type of vehicle, public transportation, all those types of things? If they know the people, they sometimes want to take the body further away, which means they can be a logical suspect. If they're strangers to the person, they could keep it closer and let the body be found there. So, and again, there could be multiple, not just two crime scenes, but more than that. Ray, I'm just going to follow up. There's a big controversy now about flock cameras in the U.S. And these are cameras. I was at a security conference last week, the Georgia Retail Organized Crime Alliance. Some good people there, GROC for short, in Kennesaw University that gave a talk there, and some people from the flock security systems were there. And there's some controversy. Do we want these cameras on our highways, on our intersections, recording tags as they go by? Perhaps if there were flock cameras in Tucson in the area of Nancy Guthrie's house, we'd have more information right now than perhaps we do. We can save this discussion, this controversy for another podcast, but this is something that I think, we as a society have to ask ourselves, do we want to be more security conscious so we can catch offenders like this? Or are we giving up our privacy and private rights, things like that, where the government, I'm using air quotes here, but Big Brother knows where we are all the time? I have no problem with people knowing where I am as long as it's not being abused. Phones are a little bit different, but my car driving down a highway, and if they had flock cameras in Tucson and whatever time it was, 2:10, 2:30 a.m., that it seems like Mrs. Guthrie went out the house, probably in a car. A flock camera would have picked up a bunch of cars, and they could
Correct.
start working backwards and figuring out where they are. So we can maybe come back to this controversy some other time. And unless you want to, I have one more part of this I want to bring up, Ray, unless you want to say something about
No,
that.
go, Jim. Go.
Yeah, the only news this week about the Guthrie case is, the lawsuit may have been filed a while ago, but it was at least back in the news today. And I remember staying up late on a Friday night here on the East Coast watching this break, that they thought they had a person of interest, 20, 30, 50 miles away from the Guthrie household and not too far from the Mexican border. And a person of interest named Carlos Palazuelos, if I'm pronouncing that right. He was held in custody for 8 hours. His, I think, brother-in-law was in the house, mother-in-law, and the homeowner, 4 people total. And now the Pima County Sheriff's Office is being sued for $3.5 million. And the lawyer wants questions answered. Why were his rights, violated? Apparently, the search affidavit is still sealed for whatever reason. The sheriff's department is not releasing it. So again, another aspect of this case that has to be resolved. We could argue about mistakes made. Maybe this was a mistake to serve the search warrant on the person's house, but would it have been a mistake not to serve the search warrant on the person's house? And this is what police and law enforcement, FBI deal with all the time. Do we have the probable cause? In this case, they took it before a judge. The judge signed off. Nobody was permanently detained, but I guess for 8 hours, at least, Mr. Palazuelos himself had his freedom restricted, and they're trying to, the family's trying to get some money out of this. So rightly or wrongly, I won't comment on that part. Maybe they just did a soft knock, the law enforcement. Hey, can we talk to you? We're the sheriff's department, Nancy Guthrie case. We have the local sheriffs here. Maybe the FBI. Can we come in and talk to you? And maybe that's all they would have needed. I understand they went in. They may have kicked the door down, guns, everybody on the floor. This will be resolved in court, maybe out of court. Who knows? But we'll see where this goes. So as far as I know, that's the latest news from this case. After we did our blitz about 2 weeks ago, or maybe a week and a half ago, with the emails, and I hope people are still listening to that. Actually, Natalie Schilling wrote a Substack. If you want to get a transcript of it, look under her Substack, and she lays it out, in bullet points, some of the things to look for in this case. So in terms of the linguistics of these notes, these emails, which we're not saying they're the abductors, but if we at least identify the person or persons who wrote those emails, I think it's one, that could at least shut down one aspect of the investigation.
We'll leave this with this one statement, Jim, and I hope you agree with me. If you don't, please tell me. But I think if you and I got this case together, I think the first thing we would do would be to throw away the existing theory, whatever that may be. Now, I'm not talking about throwing away evidence. I'm talking about the theory. And I think then we would rebuild. We'd start with the timeline. We'd go through the crime scene again, the victimology, the digital evidence, the communications, the suspect universe, the suspects that are out there, and then the behavioral analysis. We don't want to know who we think did it. We want to know what happened. And I think that's the most important part here, is we want to know what happened.
And why it happened.
Exactly. I think the why, Jim, is a lot easier than the what in this case. I think I feel very comfortable in your earlier analogy, and we've been saying this all along, that this was tied into Savannah and not her mother. Her mother was targeted because of her daughter, not because of who she was.
We'll find out someday, I hope.
I hope so too, Jim. I really, really hope so too. This next area that we're going to go into, we're going to look at the Idaho murders and Byron Kohlenberger. We're going to look at the latest defense motions and the expert strategy surrounding Kohlenberger and his claims regarding the stalking of this Madison Mogan, one of the victims. Jim, you want to jump on that a little bit?
I think my first appearance on this case on Fox News, I think, was the Friday night after Thanksgiving of that year. And of course, we know 4 dead college students, 3 young women and a young man. And I remember clearly stating that it's very possible that whoever did this was focused on one of these women. And he tried to buy her a drink at a bar, and she said no.
Yeah.
She bought it, then just walked away, turned her back. Some scenario like that. And it looks like now, whatever the exact scenario was, that somehow he became fixated on Madison, and he may have been in their apartment once before. And there's even theory that when he went to the apartment that night, he didn't know that it'd be, well, there's more than 4 people. 1 or 2 actually, at least one miraculously survived passing in the hallway. But Madison was, in fact, the intended target, which I said, I know, Ray, you and I talked about this too. And I believe on our podcast, and we said the same thing. It's very likely one of these women was the fixation of this killer, and it resulted in her and her 3 companions who just were there by chance that night, all being murdered. So, not a big surprise to me why this is only coming out now and not, during the time of the trial or the build up to it, or I should say the guilty plea. There never was a trial, but that may be happening now, or at least an attempt at that. But Ray, if you want to go back to the stalking part, be my guest.
I will, Jim. But I just want to throw this out. I want to get your opinion here. I think this is very ironic. Here we're dealing with somebody who was studying for his PhD in criminology. That means that he may understand some of the investigative techniques that law enforcement was going to use. Maybe, maybe not. But Jim, just because an offender, and I could see I could see your nonverbals here, studies criminal justice, does that make him harder to catch, or does he actually become overconfident?
Well, let's take it back. We're not going to revisit the Nancy Guthrie case. Maybe that guy has some experience with the criminal justice system or law enforcement, or listen to our podcast. I don't think we give away how to commit crimes here, but certainly there are some basic mistakes that I don't use their names, but the Idaho killer made in committing his crimes with cell phones, et cetera, driving back and forth, and others. But no, I think that this case is what it is, and I'm just curious to see where he goes with an attempt to appeal this thing. When you agree to plead guilty, you waive all those rights away. So, but yeah, the criminal justice part, I'm not sure. I guess it can't hurt, but it can also make someone pretty cocky. And there are plenty of stories in history, I think going back 100 years now, to the kidnapping of a young boy in Chicago by some, elite college men who thought they could kidnap some 14-year-old, drawing a blank on the 2 guys' names, but it's well known. And they thought they could beat the police. They were so clever. They did do it pretty well, except one of them dropped their glasses at the scene. And even back in 1926, the police could come up with the brand, the prescription, and they went to a few different eye doctors and found out who did it. So there are plenty of people like that who think they're smarter than the police. Quite frankly, some do get away with it. I look at Ted Kaczynski, mathematics PhD, and it's just something that he thought he was smarter than everyone else too, but he eventually got caught. So you can be too smart for your own britches, and whether we're talking about Nancy Guthrie or this case of the Idaho slayings, the bottom line is he wasn't smart enough.
I agree, Jim. I want to shift a little bit here in this case, because if it does come to trial, which there's a lot of indications that may happen, although I thought it was pretty clear cut when he entered his guilty plea that he did so willingly, but now he's saying his lawyer misrepresented to him that he didn't tell me what it was going to be like serving life in prison. Oh my, right? But I think that the DNA on the sheath that they found that matched him, I think that's important, but I don't think investigators should fall into a trap saying, well, we have DNA, so hey, we're good. I mean, look, the DNA, the cell data, the vehicle evidence, the timeline of this individual, his surveillance, and his behavior all point to him. And I think the strongest cases, Jim, are always built through convergence, different pieces of evidence that independently point to the same person. So, Jim, if DNA hadn't been on the sheath, do you think the investigators would have still gotten to go?
Probably through phone records and license plate recognition activity and things like that. It may have taken them longer. I'm not sure. But I think eventually his personality, he had his own issues. He had some addiction issues earlier in his life. I think he would have been identified somehow sooner rather than later. But luckily, the DNA on the sheath, the knife sheath, was also a factor and brought him in, or they identified him to the police. They did a car stop on him in Indiana or something, driving back with his father, and eventually he was arrested in Pennsylvania. So, yeah, bizarre case for a bizarre time, but I can't imagine. And there's something they're claiming in this appeal of his guilty plea, which I didn't think. I thought you signed like every document 10 times over. If you're pleading out, you're fine with your lawyers. You know exactly what you're doing. You know you're going to be in prison for life, never getting out. But apparently there's something in there. There were unknown hairs in one of the victim's hands, hair or hairs that somehow his team wasn't aware of. And look, I want to be a little careful here about the legal profession, but there are some lawyers out there. They just want to get publicity. So there's lawyers that represented him in this case. They did the best they could, whether they were paid for by the family, by the killer's family, his own money, or a public defender. I think it may have been a public defender ultimately. I'm mixing up some cases here. But then some other lawyers look at the case. Hey, haven't been in the headlines lately, and maybe we can do something with this case. And I'm not saying that's the only reason they're doing it. They may truly believe in the appellate proposition they've come up with, and they're just going for it. So this sounds like a technicality of some sort. We'll see where it comes down to. If there was evidence not turned over by the prosecution to the defense, I hear, one or two strands of hair. I'm sure they dotted every I and crossed every T. And even if that wasn't turned over, would it be a factor that would have, led him to being acquitted in a jury trial with all the other evidence they have? I don't know. So we'll just see where this goes. And we'll say the lawyers are honest and credible and moral people who are now representing him. They could also have their own agendas too.
Jim, I think withdrawing this plea potentially gives us one thing that the public never got, that I really wanted to see as well. And that's a courtroom examination of what his motive was and the full investigative theory of what they know. I mean, when we look at this, the guilty plea really gave the families somewhat of finality, but not really closure, because there's a lot of questions that were never answered. And one of them is, what was his motive? I think you and I have a good understanding of what that might have been from his behavior, but I think the family needs to hear those things. I think that will really bring closure to the family.
Yeah. Families, plural, Ray.
Right. Correct.
Sadly. So, yeah, I think we can move on from this guy, and we'll see if anything actually comes of this.
I agree, Jim. The next case we want to go into is a case that we spoke about, D4VD and the Celeste Rivas case. We kind of analyzed a little bit before about the murder investigation into recording artist D4VD, who's known as David Burke, his real name, following the discovery of a 14-year-old girl, Celeste Rivas, and she was found in his Tesla. The big question here, Jim, I think that a lot of people want to know is, why did it take 7 months from the time that she was found in the trunk of that Tesla until he was arrested?
I think her full name is Celeste Rivas Hernandez, and he is, of course, David Burke. Once again, we're not on the inside of this investigation, but Ray, you and I have been on the inside of hundreds together, and going back to my early police days, over 1,000 probably. And sometimes it is efficacious to make an arrest right away. You have the probable cause, let's just do it. But if your suspect is sort of in place, you know where he is, you know what he's doing, he's hopefully not going anywhere, and you're building your case and you're gathering your evidence, I'd rather wait and do it the right way than rush and do it the wrong way. And again, it's important to state here, this was not a serial killer that we know. Now, that would have changed the rules if we have somebody out there killing people by whatever means on a regular basis. This was, at least at that time, suspicion in one murder. So they wanted to take their time with laboratory analysis, forensic analysis from the Tesla, from his alibis, phone activity, everything. You would think maybe 7 days they could do some of these things, maybe 7 weeks. But for some reason, they felt, we know where this guy is. We know where he lives. Maybe there was some kind of restriction that they took his passport or something. He couldn't leave the country. I'm not sure how that would actually work, but they just felt that they knew they could get him when the time was right. And I much rather have a solid case that I had to wait a few months to make the arrest than making an arrest right away and having an iffy case. And I know you well enough, Ray, that you would be the same way in that regard.
I agree 100%, Jim. It's not about that David Burke was arrested. What interests me is that it's 7 months between the discovery of her remains and then his arrest. But when you look at 7 months, to a lot of people, they think that's a really, really long time. But 7 months in investigation is really actually quick. Sometimes it takes a lot longer than 7 months to build a case. And people have to understand that is an important distinction here. When you look at the Tesla that belonged to him, you have a deceased young woman who's discovered in this vehicle. She's associated with a particular individual. We're not going to get in because everything is still alleged at this point. It immediately gives investigators a direction, but it doesn't give them a murder case. It gives them a direction to look. So now we have to ask certain questions from an investigative standpoint. Who had that vehicle? Was he the only person driving that vehicle? Or were there other people driving that vehicle? He's a celebrity. I'm sure there were hundreds of people in that vehicle. Who had access most recently to that vehicle? When was the last time she was in that vehicle? Where did she die? Again, we talk about multiple crime scenes, an abduction. There's another question that just came up here. Do we think there's any relationship with David being homeschooled and its horrendous crime?
Depends who his teacher was.
Well, I guess
Charles Manson, maybe.
Right, but I mean, when you think about homeschools, a lot. I've seen a lot of kids at the collegiate level, sometimes where I taught, that were homeschooled and come in and they struggle socially. There's a big gap socially with these individuals because they don't have the opportunity to, roam with other individuals,
their peers.
Exactly. I mean, look, we were created not to be alone and stay in a house all day. We were created to interact with other people, So, I mean, that's a great question. Do I think it had an impact? I'm sure that will come into play in the pre-sentence investigation if he is found guilty, or if they start talking about his character and his background when they're talking about those things in the trial. I'm sure all that will come into play. So we will get a chance to hear that. Go ahead,
I'm
Jim.
sure the vast majority of killers of any ilk, mass killers, spree, serial, I'll bet you the vast majority of them were schooled in regular schools, public, private, whatever, and not that many homeschooled. So there's, correlation does not necessarily equal causation. And we don't even have the correlation here, homeschool versus that. So, but again, who are his peers? I mean, was he taught to write the song? What was his song? Romantic Homicide?
Yeah.
That was only, it was a metaphor or something that he said. And let me just go back a little bit, Ray. She's found in a car, but she was in really bad shape. And we're not going to get graphic here.
No,
we try to avoid it on Cold Red. But there were power tools, chainsaws, I believe, bought by, I believe they, all indications are David Burke bought them at a local Home Depot, whatever, receipts, video. And she was in the trunk for a while in warm weather. And again, I'm not going to get graphic. Ray, we've both been there. We've smelled that. We've seen that. So even just having the autopsy on Celeste, there's a lot that the pathologist just could not determine because of the bad condition of her body. So, but they may have had further lab results. They had to send them off to some, faraway labs, and they had to wait, weeks or months to get some of these results. And that's why, again, the 7-month time frame could have been a factor in terms of why it took so long to make the arrest.
I could tell you, Jim, and I think you agree here. The Tesla was more of a disposal site.
Sure.
That's not where she was killed. She was probably killed somewhere else, then placed in that vehicle. And then that vehicle was placed in another location when it took some time for them to find the vehicle, which allowed him some distancing between that vehicle. And he could say, hey, I have a lot of people that use my vehicle, so I have no idea. And I think that's going to be his defense. I mean, I can't think of any other way he would go. And I'm speculating a little bit here, but when I look at the 7 months, and we talk about the Tesla, but there's DNA, there's digital evidence. Jim, you talked about some of the things where he bought some things. There's going to be witnesses. His financial records that already showed up. I'm sure they're going to do forensic examinations. They're going to look at that tape that he made. So, there's a lot of things that are going on here. I think one of the things that jumps out to me is that investigators had an earlier encounter involving this young girl when she was reported missing. And I don't know what was missed there, but something happened. And I think if you look in hindsight, the question is, with the information that's available to investigators today, would we do things differently? And I think the answer to that, of course, is going to be yes. But I think they had some information about something going on with this young girl, with him, and that she was missing. And, it kind of just slipped through the cracks, which does sometimes, especially with young kids that kind of go off and they think they're missing and they don't really pay attention to it too much because kids always go missing. At least they think that way. But as if you're a parent or, you have that child, you don't think in that same fashion, but yet that happens.
Yeah, and we'll just close up. The police could have had informants, one or two of his buddies, his producers, his entourage, and they were working on them this whole time, maybe convincing them to wear some kind of a wire, hidden recording device, and they had to get that conversation. Now, I have no idea that took place or not. They could have tried to do this and get an admission from David Burke through one of his buddies. Say, hey, whatever happened to the girl, or what'd you do with her, and have him come out. They had to really work up to that, and that may have functioned accordingly, or maybe they just never could get the recording they wanted, and they arrested him when other lab results or other evidence presented itself for the arrest warrant. So there are all kinds of factors there. Of course, we don't know yet in this case, and we will find out when it comes to the guilty plea or the trial in the next few months or so.
Very good, Jim. I just want to say what Jim and I try and do here on Cold Red is we're not here to tell you who we think did it. We're here to show you how we would kind of investigate it, what we see. And sometimes the most important question isn't who did it, but it's what are we missing? And I think if we do that, and, I think that's important, that it's always good to look at what are we missing? Because if we had everything, we'd know who did it.
And of course, us being on the outside with prior inside experience, we miss a number of things, but we try to speculate. We try to put the missing puzzle pieces together and fill them in for our audience to say, all right, just like with the Nancy Guthrie emails, I said, here's 3 hypotheses, and I stand by it. It's going to be one of those that play out, and you can listen to that episode if you would like to. So, so we just try to put in those missing pieces. And like when I look at documents and communications, emails, it's not always the words that are used. What are the words not used, or what's missing from a communication that applies to a crime scene, and an investigation of these types of offenses. So, 4 interesting cases. One is already a conviction. That is the Idaho case, but maybe he's coming back. Nancy's still missing. David Burke is awaiting trial to begin. The trial is ongoing with Lindsay Clancy, and at least in some of these matters, in the next few weeks, we may have some results. Let's hope the same with Nancy Guthrie. That would be ideal. Not only her being found, closure for the family, but finding out who was the impetus behind this whole thing.
I agree, Jim. Jim, there's some questions here. I don't know if we have time to entertain some of these. You have a little bit of time here, Jim?
Let's do it quickly.
There's some that are statements here. One person says that Lindsay Clancy was depressed, not psychotic. She was a typical suicide person who wanted to take the kids with her. Very narcissistic. Just a lot of statements too, Jim.
I can't disagree with that.
Yeah, I agree.
The psych eval will determine her actual psychological condition, but no doubt narcissistic, and wanted to take almost her whole family with her, somehow leaving her husband to survive it all.
Well, unless our producer has a question that he wants to put out to us here, because there's so many here. I don't have a chance to go through those all. I'm not going to waste people here, but if there's a message or a question you have, one here, it says they can't find anything wrong on Nancy Guthrie cases, all refuse to see the obvious of who, what, where. Just my opinion. I didn't get that all. Just my opinion. Back to simple basics. In front of all, justice for poor Nancy. I agree with that, Sue Ann. I do, and I really believe that you need to go back and you need to, I mean, I've done it. I've done it with previous cases that I worked. I mean, Jim, in the FBI, we have cases that are 20 years old. And the one thing about it could be a fugitive case that we're going and we're looking for a fugitive. I always go back to the very, very, very beginning, and I look and I'm thinking, and I'm always asking the same questions Jim and I are asking. What did they miss? What did we miss? Why is this not solved? Why do we not have this guy in custody or this woman in custody? We're always looking to do that. I mean, that's just one of the things. Followed since day one, nonstop, 24/7, heard all the scenarios and theories from all the FBI specialists and panels, and nothing has been able to change my mind about who, why. It's the obvious. Okay.
I'm not sure what that means,
What's the obvious?
but I'm glad that this person feels, I believe it's a she, knows the obvious. And if it is obvious, you still need probable cause to make an arrest. And apparently, whatever the obvious is to you, if it is the obvious to the investigators also, they don't feel they have the probable cause to make the arrest. And just like we talked about the 7 months with the David Burke case, we're not quite to 7 months yet in the Nancy Guthrie case. Maybe, again, it's not a serial killer, serial offender. Maybe they're getting all their ducks lined up, and in the 7th month, something may happen there. But I think it's to say something is obvious as an outsider is difficult. I have my theory, my hypotheses, and Ray, I think we're kind of aligned there. It was Nancy Guthrie. I won't use the word obvious, but I would say it's a lead or a series of leads that have to be followed to their logical conclusion. If they do that, then they can move elsewhere. So
this one's for you, Jim. Do you think the author of the notes could be someone who uses formal institutional language in their daily job, writing emails all day?
Yes, people who write involving themselves in criminal investigations, the most minor ones to the most serious ones, also write as a hobby or as their profession. And as we posited a week and a half ago on Cold Red, this person we think is a native English speaker, or certainly high functioning native English speaker, and they are, relatively good writers, which means they write a lot. And most people do nowadays, texting, whatever. That's called like diary writing. When you do text, you leave out pronouns. But for that kind of email there, yeah, they write full time, either in their jobs or as in their personal life or as a hobby. And that doesn't surprise me at all.
Why hasn't the 911 call been released? Is that unusual? 911 calls are evidence.
Well, in what case were we talking
Well,
about?
I don't know, but it doesn't matter what case. 911 calls are evidence.
Yes.
And as such, they're treated as evidence and not shared with the public. It's the same thing as DNA evidence. It's not released. They say there is DNA evidence, but it doesn't give you the specifics. We know there's a 911 call, but we don't have the specifics to it. So that's the reason why it's not unusual. That's the reason why. However, we go to that Lindsay Buziak case, and I've mentioned this before, that I would love to hear the 911 call in that case. And the reason being is I have a very good friend who is an expert at dissecting 911 calls. And a lot of times, when he runs a class and it's called Is the Caller the Murderer? And he's very good at what he does. And he also has someone down in Quantico that Jim and I both know that assists him in a lot of these things as well. But 911 calls could be very telling.
And on that note, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Cold Red. Thanks to our producers, Matt McLaughlin and Matt Robinson, our music coordinator, Rick Schilling. And please like and subscribe. Check us out at coldredpodcast.com, our blog site, put questions, observations, etc. And please keep safe out there. Know your surroundings, know your environment. And everyone, we will see you next time on Cold Red.